Hi there, in this video we're going to go over all the do's and don'ts for text on a website. And I know that a lot of do-it-yourselfers or small business owners, you don't really put a lot of thought into the actual text and how it looks on your website. So hopefully this video is helpful for you. If you have already built out your website, make sure to go and check it out and see if you are making any of these mistakes, or give yourself an awesome pat on the back if you have it under control. My name is Yasmin Robles with Robles Designs, where we create jewel-worthy websites and brands for entrepreneurs who are hell-bent on taking over the world. We do this not just by creating pretty websites, but we also put some kind of thought strategy onto the site, because although your site might have all these bells and whistles and amazing looking things, you might be missing something that's important on your website, something that's important to the strategy and to actually turning those raving fans into clients. So we specialize in that, and we also offer trainings and for you a freebie. Make sure to check out roblesdesigns.com/checklist. What you'll get is a downloadable PDF where you can literally print it out if you want to, or save some trees and don't print it out, but you can go on there and check off what your website currently has, what it still needs, or as you're building out your website, you can go in there and just make sure you're ticking things off as you go. So it's really, really cool. Make sure to check that out, roblesdesigns.com/checklist. And now let's get to text on a website. So the number one question that I've been getting about text on websites, and it's really weird, I had never gotten it before, is about justifying text. I'm not sure what is bringing it up, but a lot of my clients have asked to justify their text. And what that means is basically you spread out the text. Let's say it's a paragraph, you spread it out so that it is even on both sides. So if you were to left align something, the right side is kind of jagged. If you right align something, the left side is kind of like jaggedy. When you justify it, it kind of helps fit into that column that you have allowed the text to be in. And I'm not really sure why people keep asking for it. They say that it looks cleaner, but yeah, if you're perhaps a newspaper or a print sort of business, so you're printing something out, but it doesn't actually work well on the web. It actually makes it a lot harder to read things on a website. A website is also built to be viewed on multiple screen sizes. And although, yes, I do add code so that it looks different from a desktop to tablet to a phone, there are so many screen sizes out there that it would be ridiculous to try to code the best looking justified text on every single screen size. So that, if you ask me to code for every screen size, I'll just probably laugh at you. Justified text is not very fluid, and you want your website to be fluid as it's being built out. So platforms like Squarespace, or perhaps depending on your WordPress template that you're using to build out your website, they will be pretty fluid, where they can just kind of stack themselves and rearrange the content to what would be best suited for tablet and mobile. And there are cases when they are not best suited and you can go in there and tweak it. But usually, especially with Squarespace, it'll just kind of say, okay, well, you have these two columns, I'll just rearrange them. When you justify the text, it's not necessarily like it's going to look great, and you would need to code it for a ton of different screen sizes. Instead of justifying text, typically what we do is we assign certain spaces between either the letters or the words or the even line height. We change those around, we use hyphens, but ideally what you want is to have even spacing between words and letters. So this just makes a website look a lot cleaner. You don't look like a do-it-yourselfer or a novice website designer. And it just looks a lot better than having these awkward gaps that if you justify text. Typically there's awkward gaps between certain words so that there's more space between others than others, right? So you just want to avoid justifying text at all costs. And I'm not really sure why clients that I've gotten recently keep asking for it. I never had anyone really ask for it beforehand, but I have I have clients recently that have asked for it, and it's kind of like, no, I got to push back and say that's not necessarily the best way to go when it comes to your website. The next thing to keep in mind with your text is to make sure that there is enough contrast between the text color and the background. And I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this in a couple of different videos on mistakes that you're making on the website, but I continue to see it, so I'm going to continue to repeat it. You want to make sure that there is a lot of contrast, because if somebody is a little sight impaired, they might have a hard time reading your content. And if you have amazing content that you paid for, why would you make it harder for anyone to read? Also, it could ding you with Google if they see that your website is not really ADA friendly. And you could also, I've heard, be sued for non-ADA compliance. It really depends on how big your business is, and there's all these little factors that can go into it. But you want to make sure ultimately that people don't have to squint in order to read the text. And I've seen some designers do this where they're jumping into the world of website design from a world of just graphic design where, yes, sometimes we can get away with an off gray, like a nice little gray on white. But when it comes to websites, you really just want to have the best contrast. And sometimes the gray that's chosen, because they don't want that harsh black text, the color that's chosen or the gray that's chosen is too close to the background color. So you want to make sure that you are keeping an eye out for that. And if you do use color on your website for headlines, things like that, you want to make sure that you have different options. So if you have a light blue color that you love, that's part of your brand, and you want to use for headlines, that's great. And you want to designate that color whenever your background color is dark, right? So that it pops. Same thing if you flip it around. If you have a light colored background, let's say a soft pink, what color can you place on there that will really still stand out but be part of the brand? So just keep that in mind. Make sure to have enough contrast between your text and your background color. You can Google text background color checker, and there's a lot of them out there online that you can utilize. You can put in the color code for the text and the color code for the background, and it'll tell you if you pass or fail compliance. Another mistake that I continue to see people make is having extremely overwhelming text. And by that, I mean that their paragraphs are really long, their headlines they're just really long. Everything just feels like it's a textbook that I have to read. And people are lazy, right? Even when you were in school, I don't know anyone, and I was a big nerd. I loved history class. I loved all of that. But it's still, when the teacher hands you this giant book of tiny text to read with giant paragraphs, it turns into a little bit much. So then you just start skipping over it. And if people are on your website, they're going to start skipping over your content, no matter how hard you worked on it or how informative it is. They don't want to read through all of that. So what you want to make sure you're doing is having short paragraphs that are possibly even bulleted, or that you can bold certain lines so that it's not as overwhelming. And keep in mind that people will scroll fast through it, so you want to organize it with headlines, all that great stuff. Don't let your paragraphs overwhelm people. Keep them short, keep them sweet, keep them to the point, and always remember that they're skimming through, so if they can catch the first sentence of your paragraph, that should be sufficient to give them the information that they're looking for. Along those lines, I mentioned headlines. You want to make sure that you're using a hierarchy of text. So your paragraphs, you've made sure that they are organized appropriately, that they are short enough, maybe 3 sentences long, depending on the length of the sentence. But now you also want to add headlines to your text. You want to make sure that you're designating main headlines, sub-headlines, maybe even tertiary ones, so 3rd level, and then your paragraph text. And again, utilizing bullet points or anything else that can emphasize certain aspects of your text that you want people to not miss out on. With headlines, you want to have one heading 1, and this is like your main headline, or almost like a title of your page. It introduces the page. So this is typically towards the top of the page. It's usually, when it comes to styling, the most fancy looking font that you have on your brand. And it usually should contain keywords, but please don't sound robotic. That's heading 1, and you'll only have one of those on each page. You then can utilize heading 2 or heading 2s if you have multiple. You can utilize them more than once on your website. You can have a heading 2 on every section of the site. So for example, for every thought process on that page, you would have a heading 2. And that's almost like a separator, right? So for example, on a homepage where you're talking about your services, that section could have a heading 2, the about section could have a heading 2, and just keep that in mind that it's almost like if you're skimming through, you can instantly tell which section you are on by the design and the size of that heading. From there, you could do a heading 3, and you could continue on further than that, but usually I stop around heading 3. So heading 3 works really, really well. For example, if you are breaking a particular subject within that content into a smaller piece. As an example, let's say I am writing about website design, and in my article, and you can format a page the same way, I will have a heading 1, which is introducing the topic, a heading 2, which is introducing perhaps text on a page. Heading 3 would then go into color of text, while another heading 3 could potentially go into the size of the text. And you get the idea, right? And then maybe after that, I would have another heading 2, and I already talked about text, so maybe I'll be talking about photos on a website. So you can kind of get an idea, almost an outline format, and that is how you want to structure your page. It does not have to be as boring as an outline like you did when you were in high school and writing a research paper, but you just have to keep that organization in mind and just make sure that the text is easy to read and the paragraphs are short and there's bullet points because people will be just skimming through. Ideally, with headlines, you want to make sure that if I'm quickly scanning through the site, let's say on my phone right in the middle of my lunch break, then I can get the gist of your article by just reading the headlines, or I can find the topic or portion of the article that I was really interested in by kind of scanning through and reading the headlines. Another mistake that I see a lot of people making, especially do-it-yourselfers, is having text that is literally the full width of the web page. And it depends on your screen browser size and your template and whatever it is that you're using, but usually it'll be like almost edge to edge. There might be a little bit of space on each side, and that is a big no-no. It is extremely hard to read. Imagine you having to read from one part of the site all the way to the other, then your eyes have to scan back and you have to read through this thing. It's just like really annoying. Headlines, you might be able to get away with it. Do not do that. Definitely do not do that with paragraph text. You should ideally be keeping those columns, if you want to have invisible columns in the back of your mind where your website is. Keep those columns a bit shorter than you think they need to be, and then see, as long as they're flexible and they look great visually, just make sure that they're not too wide, because it's just really difficult to read. I've also seen this with websites, especially their blog articles, where they might be a service-based business and they have a blog, they're utilizing it for SEO purposes and things like that, for news, but the blog, they put no thought into it. So literally the article, when you're reading it, you're reading it from almost edge to edge, and it's like, no, please just squeeze it in a little bit. This is also the case for some of my Squarespace course members. They are on an older platform and have not yet switched over to the new one, and there is no option really to, depending on their Squarespace version, there is no option to really squeeze that in or not. And so the newest version, though, will allow you to add padding and spacing and all that great stuff, so it doesn't feel like you're reading like one giant thing after another. Keep the columns less wide than you think they need to be. Make sure that they are easy to read, and if you feel like, damn, that's just a really wide line of text, don't do it. Try to reduce it down a little bit to where it's comfortable. All right, so when it comes to your typeface or your font style, you want to make sure that you're choosing only three max on your website, because you don't want to overwhelm people and you don't want to look like a hot mess on your site, like you couldn't decide what was actually part of your brand or not. So let's say, for example, that you have a beautiful script font, that you have a serif font, so something like Times New Roman. That is typically like the the iconic serif font because it has those little divots. So any type of font that has like little decorative pieces at the edge of the letters, that is a serif font. And then a sans serif font is typically something like Helvetica, where it's plain and modern looking. So let's say you have those 3 fonts for your website. You don't want to add more than that, but you want to designate what goes with what. So if your body copy, this is like your paragraphs, or not really essential headlines, those could all be Helvetica. And then you could say, all right, my serif font is actually going to be all my headlines. They're all just going to default to that. And then whenever I want to emphasize a particular word, that's going to be the script font that I have. So something that looks a little handwritten. And that'll just give it a touch of femininity, and it'll give it a touch of just uniqueness, because it'll break up that monotony of the rest of the text. That is a great way of doing it versus just installing the fonts, and whenever you want one font, your whole paragraph will be script, and you just don't designate it a role. It just starts looking like a hot mess. Whatever font family you want to use, make sure you have no more than 3. Make sure that you are designating a particular role to them, so that whenever, let's say your VA comes along and you just want her to update a web page, you can say, all my headlines are this particular font, and all my body copy is this particular font. And whenever I say emphasize this word, it's going to be a handwritten font. And so then they will more easily be able to go in there and make your website look consistent versus it looking like nobody knew what they were doing. The last tip is to make sure your fonts are not too small, but also not too large. You might feel like you're in Alice in Wonderland. So what I mean by that is that when you install your font, let's say you have a beautiful script font, you want to see what it looks like, the smallest possible and largest possible, and see where your limits are. Same thing with any other type of font that you're installing or adding to your website. You want to see where the limitations lie, and the reason for this is that you don't necessarily want to make it so small that, especially for script font, handwritten fonts, it's really hard for them to be read when they are super tiny. So usually they are kept for headlines, and you want to ensure you know exactly the size that is best suited, and you want to double check it on mobile, because even if it's not a handwritten font, there are certain words that will just be too long and will need to be hyphenated on mobile if you don't have custom code or the capability of saying on mobile, on this screen size, make sure to change the size of the font to this. So if you don't have that capability, you want to make sure you're double checking your fonts in the highest, know where your limits are, where the biggest size is and the smallest size is. Your paragraph text should also not be too small, because not only is it a paragraph where there's tons of words put together, but if it's just too small, nobody's going to want to read that. So you want to make sure that paragraph text is big enough, and it really depends. Again, I wish I could tell you a specific number, but it really depends on what you're uploading to your website. So I've had, in some cases, some brands where I've created their website and 16 pixels has been enough. Whereas others, it has to have been something like 2022 to be easily read. And then some bigger fonts, like headline fonts, have been way too big at 72, whereas others have been perfect at 72. So it really depends. You want to play around with it. So while you're building out your website, I recommend uploading the fonts and then just playing around. You already know that they're your brand fonts, so play around with it, see how big they can get on the website or how small they can get, and look it up on desktop, tablet, and mobile, and see what you really think looks the most stylish and the best in consistency, and then pick a middle ground. If you have the capability to add some CSS, you can always say, hey, after it gets this small for a mobile device, make sure that the headlines in this font get this small. That is it. Just keep these items in mind and best practices and do's and don'ts. With that, let me know in the comments what you think, what topics you want me to cover. Make sure to check out Instagram at Robles Design Studio and the free checklist, roblesdesigns.com/checklist, and I will catch you in the next video.